everybody to our webinar, Processing for eDiscovery, What Will We Need for the Future? We've changed the title a little bit to accommodate our last minute decisions. And first I want to introduce Joe Sherman, who's the founder and CEO of EDT. Joe's leveraged a law degree and a computer science major to apply technology to law in the international context. Over the last 25 years, she's held managing director and CEO roles in 3 legal technology companies, which she founded. She's also been engaged as a court registrar, technology strategist, a legal business analyst, a software architect, a Justice Department Information Governance Director, and a Law Society CIO. Matthew Golab, who you see in the middle here, is the Director of Legal Informatics, and as of today is also the R&D, Research and Development, Head of Research and Development at Gilbert and Tobin in Sydney, Australia. Matthew leads a specialized in-house multidisciplinary legal informatics team that utilizes a variety of data analytics and eDiscovery and other AI technology tools. He's the chair of the Lit Support Managers in Australia, is an advisory board member of the Information Government. He was an inaugural recipient of the International Legal Technology Association's Browning Marian Scholarship in 2015. He's been active in eDiscovery for many, many years, and we're very, very happy to have him on board with us today, as it's very early in the morning for Matthew. And then finally, we have, last but not least, Christoph Roggenkamp. He is our current Director of Sales at EDT. Christoph has 20 years experience in eDiscovery and is an attorney with a computer science background. He's worked at many, many of our competitors, shall I say, but has learned quite a bit over his career. So we're welcome to have welcome and blessed to have Christoph on board with us today. So without further ado, why don't you all get going, and I'll just monitor questions as they come in. Please feel free to use your chat box, and I'll keep an eye on those.
And thank you, Gail. Thank you for the introductions. This is Christoph. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. We apologize for some of the hiccups there at the beginning of the presentation, but here we go. But again, thank you for joining. Our topic today of the webinar is Processing for eDiscovery, and our subtitle is What Will We Need for the Future? And my goal right now is to sort of set the stage and talk about what we've done in the past in the eDiscovery world. So I've seen eDiscovery from pretty much every angle. I worked for an investment bank and was a consumer of eDiscovery services and tools, and then worked with our procurement department to purchase an eDiscovery tool back in 2008. Then after the 2008 recession, I kind of shifted gears and stopped working directly as a lawyer and started working for one of the major eDiscovery firms of those days, and now doing so for EDT. So I've kind of seen things from every angle. Been a project manager, been a seller of eDiscovery tools, been a purchaser, been a user, and as many of us know, who I think were on the call, it is pretty straightforward what you look for in eDiscovery tool. That hasn't changed much over time. And I just want to cover that, touch that area, so that we can talk about the exciting future that Joe and Matthew are going to talk about. But of course, and with any eDiscovery tool and for processing, you are going to be looking for things like deduplication, making sure that you can OCR from within the tool, that you don't want to take data out of one tool and put into another one. Denisting, of course, people may all know this, but nisting is a list of file types that are never going to be different. They're always the same. They have a hash associated with them, and a good processing tool ignore those and not present them to your reviewers. Of course, many productions are not in native format; they're in load file format. So you want to find a tool that can bring in load files and bring in a large variety of load files and do that smoothly and without hassle. You of course run into password protected files, and you want something that can handle passwords. Typically, at the beginning of a matter, you would talk to your custodians or talk to their IT department and try to get a list of passwords that you could put into your processing tool to try to open up password protected files as they're being processed instead of just immediately kicking an error. And then there are things like that sort of get into the early case assessment areas. So you, of course, want to have a tool that can set up email threads, concept clustering, and so on. I just want to note that in my time as working for an end customer and the bank, the email threading was the most. I think this is 10 years ago. So of course, there's a lot newer technology, but email threading was really important because it lets the reviewers read through emails in a logical way, sort of seeing in the beginning of the conversation and going through to the end. So, all of these things are what you want in your tool. Wanted to touch on them and because they are important and they will continue to be important. But there are, of course, issues with traditional processing, and these are also been known for a long time, but they're not going to change and they're not going to go away. Of course, you always have more and more data every year. I think every year is as big as all the past years combined kind of thing as far as the volume of data that enterprises and government organizations and so on handle. It just goes up and up and up, and you just need to play catch up with your infrastructure. That's never going to change. You of course have many copies of exactly the same materials, same documents, same emails, and as we sort of say here, we're drowning in duplicates. Everywhere you look, it's the same email over and over again. And then, traditionally, most eDiscovery tools processing models were consumption based, right? You would typically pay per gigabyte or per megabyte or per terabyte, and some of us feel that this is not the wave of the future. This is the sort of a thing of the past, and we need to move past that to a different model. And but that is the traditional sort of way we've handled processing. And looking forward, what we're calling Processing 2020 is where I'll hand it over to Joe and Matthew to talk about the future. And hopefully, Joe, this is officially handing it over to you as far as the next slide.
Sorry, I was on mute. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem.
I'm here. And apologies to you, Christoph. You got the less exciting slides.
Oh yeah, I got the really good stuff.
But it is interesting that in 15 years of eDiscovery, there's been lots of developments. But one thing that really hasn't evolved is processing, in our humble opinion. And we think there's enormous opportunity to be doing things better. If I can suggest upstream before we start doing the analytics and downstream review of documents. So Matthew is a dear colleague and friend who I've spent many hours sort of throwing ideas around with, so I'm delighted to be able to have this opportunity to share some of our thinking with those that are attending this webinar. We're going to be talking about some natural language processing developments that are starting to become very relevant for pre-processing of data in eDiscovery, cloud, similarity analysis, and what we're referring to generally as feature extraction is another sort of general topic. So we might sort of get stuck into that. If you could progress the slide there, Gail or Christoph. I'm not too sure who's running the slides.
It's Christoph.
Yeah, thank you. So Matthew, you might like to share your thoughts on this notion. I know that we've actually spoken often about this notion that natural language processing is really going to be the new processing, or the cream the cream on top of the milk, I guess, that we've been doing for a long time. So what are your thoughts on that? And do you want to share sort of some of your experiences and perspectives in terms of where that could go?
Sure. And growing up on a dairy farm, I guess that analogy works for me because I love full cream. And I apologize if no one understands me because I'm still waking up and probably speak a bit quickly. But anyway, so yes, I guess that one of the challenges we face is data in 2019 is not limited to the traditional email attachment and document, and data comes in many forms in the sense of structured metadata, like say a JSON file from Slack, or Facebook or Microsoft Teams or Office 365 or who knows. So we've definitely got challenges in how to I guess use processing in a smart way where you may be trying to shoehorn data into an email-centric model. And so natural language processing in terms of being able to, I guess, enrich the data and sanitize the data. So in terms of removal of noise, a frustration I have is if you have an email thread that's 20 deep, so 20 parts of the email in the chain, and each email has 5 to 10 recipients, you then have a footer, 20 deep footers, and 20 deep 5 to 10 recipients. I forgot how many people I said. And if every email message was a few words or a sentence, there's a high risk that when you try and search or filter or cluster or do whatever or deduplicate, that the actual message text that you're interested in is lost in all the noise of the headers and the footers and stuff. And so being able to cleanse those, and I guess from an entity perspective, so in AI it's called NER, named entity recognition, but to be able to extract and enrich and do that across many forms of data, so that if you think of email threading is great for emails, but if you think of Bloomberg, Reuters, Facebook, iMessage, being able to then show a thread where multiple people may have had a conversation across disparate systems.
Absolutely. It's a theme. I think we've got a slide on this a bit later, which we'll touch on, but this notion that we should be looking at conversations between people of interest, no matter what the medium was that they were using at the time. So they might start out in email, and then they might move to WhatsApp, and then they might go to SMS, and all of these disparate channels through which people communicate really need to start coming together into what we think is the conversation paradigm. And it's very different to the way we've traditionally thought of emails as belonging to email threads. And I think your point, Matthew, about the cleansing of the data is a really potent one. One of the things that I think we've all encountered in this domain is the fact that the data that we receive is so noisy and is full of so much rubbish or trash, as our US colleagues would say, and getting rid of that trash, particularly email footers and disclaimer clauses, is something that really enables far improved analytics downstream. So these are all techniques that are possible, of course, if you have a natural language processing suite of libraries and capabilities in your pre-processing pipeline, which is all part of the data preparation that we think is going to be needed increasingly for the future. And
Joe, just on the I guess entities and POI, people of interest, and aliases, to be able to then normalize between a person, how their name is resolved from a person's address book, their personal email, someone else's address book,
yes,
the domain, but also their, say, identity in iMessage or in Bloomberg, or their mobile phone number, and being able to map all of those and conform it to here's how to show the narrative of one person in a simple way.
Exactly. And do you think, Matthew, that model, and as you know, we've been doing a lot of R&D in this area, but do you think that model it means that the paradigm is moving away from a document-centric view towards a more person of interest centric approach to analysis of potential evidence?
To give you a legal answer, it depends, but it is and it isn't, in that I guess it depends on the style. Are you doing an investigation, or are you involved in litigation, or is it a regulatory response? But I think having this is enormously powerful across anything you're doing. So it's another way of being efficient.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we've got a couple of slides, Christoph. The next few slides actually show representations of what we're talking about. I think one of the best ways to demonstrate these concepts is to look at the Hillary Clinton email data set, which was actually released publicly. Great, except that it was one PDF document, a single PDF document containing 7,121 pages of emails that had been printed, scanned and OCR'd. So in the hands of an eDiscovery expert or practitioner, this kind of data is just such a pain because it doesn't have all those nice elements extracted. It doesn't have, the metadata. And increasingly, what we think we're going to start seeing in eDiscovery is tools that can actually go in and extract meaning from text. So, for example, the traditional approach to parsing email data is to just, pull out the headers, and all of those header fields go into fields in a database that you can use to search, so you can do analytics on the communication analysis. But the problem is that the email body itself is not really analysed. So applying some good algorithms, some natural language processing techniques, and even sometimes a bit of predictive analysis, a bit of machine learning here and there, we can start to do some pretty powerful stuff. And this is something that our new discombobulator tool does, as it looks at the text of an email body and starts to identify the metadata hidden and kind of dumbed down within the text of an email body. Here you can see the different elements of the actual emails that are contained within another email, which was what I think you were referring to earlier, Matthew, when you were talking. Sorry, you're going to have to pick up the conversation while I cough. I'll let you.
No problem, Joe.
I'll let you pick it up here, Matthew or Christoph.
Yeah, no. So I think what Joe was about to talk about was that instead of looking at the emails of all body text, where the software detects at the very top some header information from, sent to, subject, and it assumes that the rest of the message is all body text. You'd want a tool that can actually intelligently go through and identify in a long stream of text different email conversations here, different pieces of the thread. So instead of it just assuming everything's body, it sees then there's another email below the first one and identifies in the header information and so on, and even goes to look for signatures and footers and that kind of thing. So this is definitely a forward-looking future approach for processing.
So Matthew, the notion at the referenced at the bottom there is that we identify footers and disclaimers. I think that's what you were referring to earlier when you were talking about noise and getting rid of the noise early.
Yeah, that's right. So that if you're searching or clustering or showing what is a similar, that you want to purge and only have the white text that you've shown on here. So given you may have the email recipient's subject and the date as metadata, as structured data, so you can use that in different ways. But what you really want to get to is, and what did they say?
Absolutely.
And get into that instead of not just all the noise, but get a lot more of the useful information, right?
Yeah.
Sure. And Christoph, do you want to advance the screens a couple of, actually go back a little bit. I just want to see the POI stuff there. Yeah, so here's another example of, sorry, I lost the audio. Here's another example of this notion of extracting meaning from text. So having powerful algorithms that can identify that multiple versions of a person's email is actually the same person. When you're investigating, for example, Jacob Sullivan, you want to find all the versions of their name that exists in the data set. And this is something that
I just want to point out here, Joe, that this was a scanned and OCR data set. So this is Jacob J. Sullivan. His email is sullivanjj@state.gov, but because of the scanning process and maybe quality of the original documents, we are getting all these different variations on his sullivanjj@state.gov email address, which is what we see here in the blue.
Absolutely. And maybe you could go another screen there, Christoph. So I think we've probably made the point there that when you've got good analytics or good natural language processing tools, algorithms, and analysis tools running across your data, you can do all sorts of powerful stuff. Not only get rid of noise, but also extract meaning and context. And I think further down, if you just progress the slides again, because I'm just mindful of time, you can do things obviously like create heat maps to show correspondence between different people, and these sorts of analytics are obviously now included in pretty well every tool that's out there on the market, but the power of the analytics is always compromised by poor processing. So it's rubbish in, rubbish out. If we improve the processing upstream, then we should be able to get much better analytics in terms of the downstream tools that we're using to investigate. Thanks, Christoph.
And this is just a different look at what we had seen before, but this is you taking one email document, and a good tool will actually recreate multiple emails within that first presumptive email and into what you see here: the headers, the opening, the signature, and so on, and then the footer. But a good tool will be able to not only make recreated emails out of an original document, but also identify the parts of the email for your analytics and further processing.
Thanks, Christoph.
Yeah, Joe, you're right. We should be mindful of time. You want to move on to the next topic?
Yes, please. Matthew, do you want to sort of lead the discussion on this? This is something that you've got a bit of experience in.
Yeah, so I'm just giving a law firm perspective. I guess the cloud, so from my perspective, there are several forms of cloud. There's having, say, in AWS, you're building your server infrastructure how you would have traditionally within your firm in the cloud, where you have then, you've basically transferred the same model and you're just doing it in AWS, and then having the ability to very rapidly spawn, clone, whatever you call it, but ramp up, scale up more resources where you build images and spin them up. And then you've got, I guess, SaaS, where you're using someone else's system, or you have a private instance or something on someone else's system, or you're sharing someone else's system, would be the cloud thing. I guess the complication for a law firm is that your clients are trusting you with their data, and some of those clients are, like, say, if it's a government client or a very sophisticated institution, then they're going to be quite stringent in wanting to understand from a security perspective the data footprint, who has access to it, do you have control over it, is it fully encrypted, can you easily take it down and and just giving them comfort about the where the data goes.
Absolutely. Do you think this movement towards private clouds is going to positively impact that at all, Matthew?
Yes, I do. I guess, you know, if you ask a security person, then theoretically cloud is absolutely encrypted and absolutely more secure than a physical server, from a perspective of encryption keys and stuff. But I guess there's just that uneasiness about if something is in the cloud versus something physical. Physical, you're able to have physical measures in place, whereas it's then accessible to, say, you know, hackers and stuff in the cloud.
Sure. I think though that sometimes it's all more about perceptions than reality, isn't it? Because there's some very problematic security holes in many law firms, and conversely, there are some pretty tight cloud deployment options. But it often comes down to perceptions as well as the reality of having the right people setting it all up for you.
Yep.
One of the things that we're seeing, our platform has traditionally been installed on-prem on client sites over many years, but we're seeing increasingly our clients wanting to put it in the cloud, and often it's a BYOI model, bring your own infrastructure, rather than them coming to us to offer the whole stack or the whole platform as a service. What they're after is a software license that they can run on infrastructure that they own and control, and I think that's going to be an increasingly popular solution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Matthew, what about licensing models associated with that? So, for example, the way licensing has worked for a long time, and do you think that will be impacted by some of these new deployment options?
Yeah, I guess I get nervous about licensing that is based on volume versus annual licensing, particularly because these systems are immensely powerful with larger volumes. But if you have a model where you charge a processing fee and a hosting fee, and where it's based on volume and time, then it's complicated, because then you're worrying about the cost and the value to the client, and you may then be trying to work out how to not use the system to be more efficient, whereas you really need to use the system. So what I'm talking about is pre-culling, where you say not loading all the data into the system, whereas, you know, obviously a system with duplication and various filtering things, it's a lot more efficient to use a system that's tailored for that.
Absolutely. I think that that some of these new deployment options are certainly solving that problem that people have had in terms of volume-based charging, and it's certainly something that we've tried to avoid. We offer options, but we think it's pretty important to make sure that you don't force people down that volume-based charging model, because the volumes are just getting so enormous, and it really does scare people off.
This is Gail. Yeah. Can I interject real quick?
Sure.
Because it's right on point to what you're discussing. Someone has asked, what type of licensing will EDT offer?
Yeah, sure. Well, our licensing is based on multiple deployment options. So it can either be on-prem, BYOI, that is on-prem or on your own cloud infrastructure, or we can do a PaaS offering, which is platform as a service, which is the whole bundle is all bundled up together, and we look after the infrastructure as well. So it just depends on what people want, as well as, of course, the portable licensing model where everything's installed on a laptop. So that's another option, which is becoming increasingly popular, actually. particularly in the EU, in relation to data sensitivity, GDPR type scenarios where people want to take the tools on site rather than collect the data and take it off site. Are you seeing much of that sort of thing in Australia, Matthew? Is there any interest in portable solutions for these sorts of cases so that you can sort of take the tools to the data?
A trend I'm seeing is in very large and sophisticated clients is they're building up their in-house teams and having a lot more preference for how they engage with the law firm and whether you're using their system. So I wouldn't say portability where client is mandating take the processing into them, more that the client makes a call to invest in having their own capability. And obviously that's nothing new, but it's a reasonably new trend in the Australian market.
Sure.
And Joe, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but
yeah,
this is right in line with what you're discussing, and I don't want to lose the train of thought. The attendee wants to know if we're going to be offering volume pricing.
we don't like doing it. If a client forces us down that path, and quite a few government RFPs do force the vendor community to only submit volume-based pricing, we sometimes reluctantly respond to those opportunities, but we prefer not to do volume-based pricing.
Thank you. That's it for questions from the attendee for now.
Do you want to go to the next slide, Christoph? I'm mindful of time here.
Absolutely. This is getting look at some similarity analysis.
Yeah, again, Matthew, I think this is a theme we've talked about often. We've done a little bit of collaboration together in relation to the analysis of documents and the analysis of concepts in documents and some of the emerging algorithms, the neural networks, shallow neural networks, and algorithms like Word2Vec, and some of the new opportunities to detect concepts, not just looking at raw text. So there's all sorts of powerful things that we can do. But do you want to just sort of summarise, I guess, from the beginning, what you think the problem is, and what you know, your take on how it should be resolved?
Sure. So I guess going back to that Hillary Clinton example, you have an email that's provided to you flattened in a PDF, and you may have parts of that email chain from other sources. You've got other scenarios of you get an email from a mobile device, you get the same email from Exchange or Google Takeout, you get the email from an Office 365 account, and or you get it from an email archive system. That there can be subtle differences in what's effectively the same email to a human, but when the MD5 algorithms run, there is a difference. And so you've got the complication of you do the traditional MD5 deduplication, whether it's by custodian or globally. And we find this all the time with clients that say have a Exchange server on premise and they use Office 365, and there might be a collection from both systems, that you'll have identical emails with different MD5s, and so you've got the headache of trying to look at how can you deduplicate those and have the comfort of knowing they're identical. And then the new duplicates, where particularly I guess in that Hillary Clinton example, where you've got that email thread, and wouldn't it be great to be able to say with confidence, and I guess I'm blurring into threading, but you may not have every part of that email thread as individual emails, but you do have them because they're reconstituted in that initial PDF.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it can be can be really challenging. Going back to your reference, though, to near dupes, Matthew, is it worth sort of defining what you think a near dupe is? Because I've found that a lot of people actually don't really use that term consistently, and it'd be nice to hear your take on it, which I think is similar to mine. But let's explore that.
I'm not quite awake, but I feel there's a joke coming on where you're talking about near dupes and we have to define what near dupes are. So I guess where you've got subtle differences in metadata, like for example, you have my email address resolved, and then you've got the same email from a different device which has the email address resolved differently. Or say the formatting looks a bit wonky. One's plain text, one's rich text. And so they're very similar, but they're not duplicates.
Sure. And often the way I find, the method I use to sort of help explain it is often just text-based similarity. So if you're just looking at the text rather than, a digital fingerprint, I think that lawyers tend to sort of get their heads around that a little bit easier than the new. But it's really interesting though. Sorry,
Joe. Another example would be I send an email to an external recipient and my system applies a footer outbound of my system. So in my sent items, I don't have a footer on my email. But in someone else's mailbox, an external recipient, they have the same email with a footer.
Yes.
So obviously they're different emails, but to a human, they're the same thing, except they have very different text because one has the footer applied and it's external, and there may, say, be a very slight difference in the sent date on my machine versus the recipient's machine, as in microseconds difference or something. So they are absolutely different, but they're very similar and near duplicate.
Absolutely. That lends weight to the argument for upstream data cleansing to remove the noise, like the footers and the disclaimer text blocks, of course. But I also think it's interesting to look at the motivation behind the detection of duplicates and the detection of near dupes, because often you want to detect near dupes so that you can do bulk coding in a similar way for documents that are all pretty much the same. Whereas duplicate detection in the purest sense of MD5 is often so you can just reduce the data set and get rid of the data in an early culling phase, so the data volume goes down. Is that a fair sort of reflection of how you think the two different technologies are used in practice?
Yeah, that's right. And I guess ideally what you want is for the reviewer to look at one document and as in a single unique example, and somehow have a model where you can propagate that coding to what's effectively the same thing to a human, but is slightly different. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is the sort of thing that we're certainly doing a lot of work on. I guess it's also quite interesting to consider the notion that a similar two documents are actually near dupes if they've got a score that's close to 100 in terms of the similarity. So if you've got a score of 100, it probably means that the text is exactly the same, but there could still be some very minor digital differences. So it is a space that I think is going to get more sophisticated, and it's important to have a deep understanding of what your processing tools are doing to enable you to triage the different methodologies that can be used for these sorts of upstream analysis capabilities. I don't think we'll talk about neural networks today, Matthew. We're going to run out of time, aren't we? Suffice to say that concept analysis is almost probably the fourth bullet there. But here we go. We had a couple of screens. Maybe we'll just quickly do a screen. This is a slide set that I used recently to explain the difference between sort of traditional similarity analysis, which is used by most TAR technology engines. So it's the very traditional approach to looking at the actual words between three documents. Here we've got three candidate documents, and the question is, which ones are similar? And if you just progress the slide there, Christoph. Using the traditional approach, which is actually a bag of words, often called a bag of words approach, all that the algorithm does is it looks at all the common words and assesses whether or not two documents are similar because they've got common words. That's actually the similarity detection methodology that's used by most TAR engines at the moment. The reason we don't think it's necessarily the only or the best way to go, it's an option, but it's not necessarily the best way to go, because what you often want to do is look at the conceptual similarity when you're determining the effectiveness of a TAR framework or a predictive analysis framework. And this slide here just sort of shows that although the first and the third documents are very similar in concept, they're not getting a high score in the traditional approach. But when we start using a deep learning approach, such as the word embeddings that, Matthew, I think we've been working on this kind of stuff for a while with you. Do you have a take on this? Is this sort of resonating for you? I don't think I've shown you these screens before, but this is very much the sort of thing we've talked about often.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I guess to be able to have a word embedding model that is learns from scratch for each transaction or each matter, so that the system only knows about in terms of the relationship. And obviously we've fast forwarded to a lot of advanced concepts in what word embeddings mean, but basically you're able to use quite advanced AI to a human. These are synonyms. They're very similar, and you look at it and you intuitively know the meaning is the same, but those words are very different words. And even in keyword searching, going back to the very traditional model, you would get hits for these as well.
Absolutely, yeah. It's an interesting field that I think we're going to see a lot of activity in over forthcoming years. Christoph, we're running out of time. We might just quickly go through the next couple of slides. I think we've covered off on this to some extent. We've done a lot of work lately in relation to the ingestion of mobile device data using load files from systems like Celebrite and some of the competitive products that are out there that are a little easier to use than the Celebrite load file. But increasingly, these formats are going to be critical as data ingestion options for a modern processing platform. And of course, the power of the data manipulation once the load file is ingested is of crucial importance in terms of identifying images, messages, and all of the different communication channels that you were talking about earlier, Matthew. Matthew, are you seeing a lot more mobile phone data collection in eDiscovery?
Yes, and I guess data forms, so it's structured data, but it may be given to you in a JSON file or a CSV or just a large text file, and so you have to. So I've skipped away from mobile, but you're then repassing it, I guess, interpreting it and fitting it to some kind of message or email concept.
Yeah, or maybe even a new kind of medium neutral schema or a medium neutral framework for conversation analysis, because email is going to be less and less prevalent, don't you think, over time as we start to use more and more instant messaging and collaborative tools for communication? So the conversation analysis becomes sort of more of a central element rather than, an email-centric model.
Yeah. So a thought that just occurred to me, and it rarely happens, so I thought I'd share it, is going back to the concept of the EDRM, and if you could have a load file standard for, here is a Celebrite image from a iOS device or Android, or for it's a data from an app or from a system, and being able to, I guess, map and deduplicate. So imagine if we have an industry standard model for managing all those different data types.
You're singing to the choir, Matthew, but I just I live in hope. When will we get these sorts of standards emerging? It's just I don't know. I hope it happens at some point. But there's so many different types of data sets coming together now that it would be nice to have a bit more activity in the standards domain.
And just want to know, we have about 5 minutes left, so maybe we want to start wrapping things up and see if any more questions that have come in, possibly.
I have just a couple.
So,
just two. So go ahead and take the time you need.
Yeah. Joe, do you want me to walk through the I'll walk through the traditional like I did in the beginning, and you can talk about the newer processing requirements?
I don't know if we even need to say too much about this slide. I think it speaks for itself. I think in summary, what we're saying is for those that are looking at new processing solutions, it's time to sort of look beyond the traditional checklist, which is the sorts of things at the top of the screen there. We won't go through them because anyone with more than a few days experience in eDiscovery knows this stuff pretty well. And there's a few others, but there's sort of some of the most common elements that have been traditionally used, but increasingly there's just a lot more interesting stuff on the horizon, and hopefully we've covered off on some of those in this webinar. I do think that it's not all about functionality, it's also about flexible deployment and flexible pricing, and they're obviously two very key philosophies that we have at EDT, but we're also excited about some of the new R&D that is possible in relation to natural language processing and some of the other powerful tools. And we have really enjoyed, Matthew, collaborating with you over recent times, and look forward to further collaboration. And it'd be great to hear from anyone who's listening to this webinar if they're interested in learning a little bit more.
Would you like me to give you the questions that I've gotten from a couple of the attendees? Sure. All right. First question is, what is the processing feature most requested by your clients?
Christoph might know that one. I guess off the top of my head, I would say right now we're often being asked about deployment options, cloud-based deployment, portable deployment, scalability, pricing model. So, there's a general assumption now in this very mature market sector, whatever we decide to call it. What do you call it, Gail? You keep saying it's not an industry, it's a profession. In this very mature profession, the functionality has now sort of become very normalized and standard. But what really is important now is more about pricing, volume expansion, elasticity of infrastructure. Those sorts of things are becoming important to people.
Okay, great. And the other question I have is, do you think the eDiscovery market is moving away from the per gigabyte pricing?
I think we've covered off that one pretty well. I think it should be, and some are. some are, but I think there's a lot of education that's still needed. And clients, I think, need to understand that they're in the driving seat and they don't have to go down the per gig charging model. They can sort of push back if that's the only option that vendors are offering.
Great. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much for attending, everyone. Thanks, Gail. I'll let you wrap up.
All right. Well,
Yeah, thank you.
I want to thank everyone, including our speakers, Joe, Matthew, and Christoph. Great job today. We have recorded this and it will be available at discoveredt.com within a day. And you'll just need to go to our videos under resources and we'll find it there. And if you have any questions that you need to ask after this webinar, feel free to email me directly, gail@discoveredt.com, and that's Gail, G-A-Y-L-E, and I'll make sure that your question gets to the right person. So again, thank you for your participation, and thank you speakers, and especially Matthew for getting up so early to do this with us. We really appreciate your time, and everyone have a great day and a great 4th of July.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.